name is Sam Scott. I'm obviously your last speaker. All right, everyone's ready? Today I learned the plural for armed brown peoples is terrorists, while the plural for armed white people is militia. Now this eye-raising quote from the Christian Science Monitor on January 4th of this year clearly illustrates a very high-profile issue in our country right now. This issue is that of the Oregon militia. This group of armed people who is basically trying to capture government land and hold on to it away from the government. Now, the question that we have to be asking ourselves is, do these people actually pose a threat? Are they posing a threat to our nation? Are they posing a threat to our peace? Or are they simply people speaking their minds? I'd like to answer the question, will the Oregon militia situation escalate into a violent conflict? With a firm no. This will not escalate into a violent conflict because of how the government is responding and really the mindset behind the militia. Their mindset of not wanting a violent conflict and wanting to peaceably negotiate this. Now, before we get into the two mindsets that are at play here, let's just look at a little bit of background of exactly what's going on in this situation. According to The Guardian of January 8th of this year, these people are basically protesting the federal land ownership, basically wanting the federal government to hand most of the federal land back to the states and to the people. Now, they're protesting this, some of them armed, some not, by occupying a federal land reserve in Oregon. They're led by Emma Bundy, somebody who's been reported in the past for being very against federal government ownership of land. However, throughout this, we haven't really gotten any more details beyond that. We have no idea what their numbers are, and really the public hasn't had very much direct communication with these people. So what's the federal response looking at like right now? What's the government doing to respond to this apparent issue in our country? Well, they're actually, according to the Atlantic on January 5th of this year, they're actually making a very low-key response. The government's they're not making a very big deal about this at all. With the scope of the project, you expect there to be a very large media response, a very large government response, but we haven't seen any of that. The government's basically quietly addressing this issue. Now, the reason for that is explained later on in this article by The Atlantic, where they said this is actually the best solution. It's the best solution for both parties involved because it keeps the situation from blowing up at all, but it also it prevents the loss of life on either side. By keeping it very low key, we're allowing the militia to speak their mind, while still getting the government, but still allowing the government to be involved and to quietly resolve the issue. Another thing that the government's doing that's helping with this is they're not legitimizing it. Now, throughout this whole conflict, according to Time on January 4th, so a few days after it started, the White House said that it's not going to declare these people terrorists. They're not going to call them terrorists. They're merely going to deal with it on a local level. Now, this has stirred. They've also talked about how they're going to make a very slow response, not jump into anything too quickly. Now, this has stirred some controversy. As the opening quote I read talks about, people are very angry about this, saying obviously we need to make a full-on response to these. However, this response makes a lot of sense. Because we're doing this, we're basically preventing this conflict from escalating anymore. We're keeping the conflict at the level where it is, where nobody's been hurt yet, and we're allowing them to speak their minds, and allowing for the possibility of a peaceful resolution. We're also allowing for open communication between the United States government and these people. These people who are trying to speak their minds, labeling them terrorists would not assist us in getting through to them and eventually resolving it. So now we've looked at what the government is talking about, let's actually look at what these people are thinking. In an article written for The Guardian on January 9th, on January 12th, it talked about exactly what the people are thinking. There were several interviews with a few of the protesters in Oregon. Now, they all have said they're mostly a peaceful group. They do not in any way want there to be a violent response. They talked to Melissa Cooper, who is a mother leaving her 3 kids at home to protest this. And she said that mostly spirits are pretty high, and they're trying to slowly resolve this issue, and definitely do not want to lead to violence. Later on, it interviewed Deborah Pope, who's a 61-year-old woman, who said that she loves this country and hopes that we can resolve this without any loss of any injury or loss of life. These people are trying their best to resolve it without any violence. Yes, they have different opinions. Yes, some of them are armed, but they're not actually taking any action to lead to any violence, and they're willing to negotiate on this. So now we can see that both the government's response and these people's mindsets really isn't a recipe for violence. What will happen? Well, right now we don't know for sure what will happen. However, there are two highly possible scenarios that we can work with. The first is that the federal government simply grants them their demands. Now, The Guardian on January 8th, a different Guardian article than the one I read earlier, talked about how this would actually lead to, that this would probably not be the best thing for the environment. It could lead to environmental destruction because handing over federal lands would obviously negate federal regulations. However, this is a possible outcome from this, depending on the direction the federal government wishes to go. But the second, and I think the more likely outcome, is that the support simply falls apart. According to The Atlantic on January 12th, after 11 days out there, these people have mostly lost their local support. Initially, they had a large amount of support from the local community, supplying them food, blankets, anything they need basically to be able to stay out here in the wilderness for a long period of time. As of a couple weeks ago, they've lost that support mostly. Most of the locals simply want them to get off the land and so they can resume life normally. So they're rapidly losing support. There's only a certain amount of time they can stay out. Eventually, they're going to have to cave, and the federal government's ready to react to that very non-violently. At the end of the day, we can see the situation isn't going to escalate. It's not going to escalate because of the federal government's response and because of these people's mindsets. We can see that whatever happens in the end will not be a violent response, and this will be a peaceful situation. Thank you.